All right. Well, last week we read Hebrews 11 and the theme was by faith. We started with word association to kind of expand our vocabulary around faith so that we could talk a little bit about the nuances of what we each understand faith to be. Because the first line of Hebrews 11 is faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. And then we read through some Old Testament review. Some of those names were fairly obscure. We talked about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. We learned some midrash, which is like outside of scripture, rabbinic commentary on those stories. Then we discussed that word faith and how it's often in English defined as an agreement with an idea, but in Hebrew culture, faith included action. So we did a little word study and we learned about enuma, which is the root word for amen, which means to stand. That's a word for faith. We also talked about the word kavah. Q-A-V-A-H would be like phonetic spelling, which could be translated as hope or wait. But again, not passive. We talked about how kavah is like being a gardener. You know, you still tend, you water, you weed, you prune so that the plant is enhanced, right? But you know, the growth of that plant is not caused by your actions. You just try to facilitate. So we talked about that. And then we talked about the Greek word, the New Testament word, and noun and verb for faith is from the same root, and it's pistis or pistuo. But again, I think we tend to only think of it as a noun, but in Hebrews 11, faith was definitely presented as a verb, you know, action. So that was last week, and this week we are going to be in Hebrews 10. We're going to read 23 through 36. I think 23 kind of starts in the middle of a paragraph. We'll look at it in a minute, but one thing that I want to make sure that we I enjoy, is I have a little activity, and you can't overthink the activity or worry about other people's preferences. So I'm going to show Eden what it is too, and then I've got rocks, and then I'm wondering, do you want to stand up and put your rock in a jar, or do you want me to pass around the jars? What would be your preference? Pass it around. Okay. All right. So I'll turn it this way. I have a bowl of rocks, and I'll take one for Eden and myself here. So everybody take a rock, and if you hang on, you might want to take more than one rock if you feel that way. So there are 3 jars, and you have to vote. So here is your sentence stem, and then here are your responses. So here's the question. When I disagree with something another person believes, when I disagree with something another person believes, I usually keep quiet, try to change their mind, or express my own beliefs. Okay, so again, don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Keep quiet, try to change their mind, express my own beliefs. And if you feel like, the reason I said you could have 2 is if you feel like you're in 2 camps, you know, what I was going to do if you wanted to just come up is you could set your rock between 2 of them. You know, between a rock and a hard. Right. Sunday school rocks. Good, nice stuff. So Eden, if you have a jar you want me to put yours in, kindly.
Oh, yeah. Usually I keep to myself.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it depends on the person.
But if that's the truth, that's the truth. So we should put it there.
Yep. All right, thanks.
Okay. These are from the Sunday school wing, so I'm not sure. Well, if you took one, I guess you, but if you took more than one, I guess you could vote twice. If you feel like you're in two camps. All right, did everybody get a chance to vote? Okay, I gotta switch. So,
This is a lot, and this is.
okay. Let's see. We need to count. Would anybody be willing to count? All right. Anyone else? This is gonna be easy.
A lot of rocks moving around.
Okay, so thank you very much. We had in the keep quiet jar, 19 votes for keep quiet. How many do we have in it? What is it? Express my own beliefs. 16. 16, so 19, I'm gonna put them in order. 16, and then try to change their mind. 3. 19, keep quiet. 16, express my own beliefs. 3, try to change their mind. Okay, thank you. I would love for one person from each category to share their rationale. If you feel so free to do that. Because we learn a lot from each other. And it doesn't have to be like, super erudite or anything, but just tell us why you picked what you did. Anybody?
Well, sometimes I don't want to cause conflict.
So you were in the keep quiet category?
Only part of the time.
I'm in the keep quiet category. Yes, Denny.
Be quiet. My reason is that's their beliefs. It's none of my business.
I sometimes will try to express my beliefs, and then if I'm outnumbered, I shut up, so I keep quiet, but it depends on the situation, but I will try to, especially if I know that they have misinformation.
It is interesting how close those two were, the keep quiet and express my own beliefs. I feel like, we're almost so close that because some of us took more than one rock, that we could be statistically quite the same. And then the outlier really is the try to change people's mind, at least as far as this group is concerned. Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
Keep quiet because it's a big deal.
Power has a lot to do with whether or not we keep quiet or express our own beliefs, I think, doesn't it? Or the setting, like you said, if you're outnumbered, or so sometimes that is based not always on an internal thing, but on the externals, right? Who's allowed to, so to speak.
So that would also be, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
And I think, I put one in each, and I think it's, when I would try to change someone's mind, it depends on how well I know.
So you know them well.
So it's a situation,
Yeah. So there's
like if it's my kid.
relationship makes a difference if you're willing to try to engage in that way. Gotcha. All right.
I was responding, just trying to be very honest, because sometimes so thinking of the recent political things with misinformation. So I would try to, when there were people that would be sharing crazy stuff that I thought was crazy for me, I would try to do fact checks so that I would try to keep giving them information. And then I realized that was fruitless at times, so sometimes my less rational part of my brain takes over and I'm just trying to fix it all. And then sometimes I'll express my own beliefs if it depends on the situation. And if people ask for it, especially in my own family, I'm taking cues,
Yeah.
I did raise a bunch of kids, but now we have grands, and so things are different. So I just weight to express, sometimes I keep quiet. So I would, if I had three, I would have put one in each.
Yeah. Very contextual for you.
So anyway, I was just thinking, first thoughts, yeah.
Yes, I agree, and I think that we all probably have a tendency, right, towards maybe one of the camps and then, but that's not always the way we operate.
Right.
Yeah. It is interesting, in our, I'm thinking too about like social media and, because it doesn't seem like, at least as far as I can tell, that try to change another person's mind is underrepresented, let's just say in social media, right? I mean, that seems to be the operational principle. So I find that interesting. So it makes me wonder, does that only appeal to a certain segment, right? Meanwhile, there's many, many more who are quietly on the sidelines who won't, right? So again, like the echo chamber idea is very real. Because it's only the ones that are truly, I don't wanna say enjoy, but whose wish is to change someone else's mind, who even engages in that way. So then we overrepresent that segment. I don't know, these are just thoughts I have. Because today we are gonna talk about perseverance. And we're actually gonna go back a chapter into Hebrews. So thank you everybody for voting. So there's a shared community that is hopefully, right, through the reading, being motivated with courage to endure. So not giving up, this idea of perseverance is part of the witness. It's done not, well, how do I say this? The courage to persevere is part of the witness. It doesn't happen in spite of the witness. Does that make sense? It's part of one's Christian faith. So I want to give you some background on Hebrews. We've done this before, but I want to give you a little background on this part. So this congregation is surrounded by threats at the time of this writing. And they didn't know if it would be safe to continue to meet in person. Did you hear me?
Yeah.
They were surrounded by threats and they weren't sure if it was safe to continue to meet in person. But they needed encouragement to keep going in daily life. Should they meet with greater restrictions or should they not meet at all? And how would they reach out to those who didn't come to worship? And how would they help younger members learn about Jesus? It was pretty overwhelming. In fact, the community even wondered if Christian faith was worth the trouble. So then someone speaks up, right, and reminds them of God's faithfulness in the past. So that is the context of what we're going to be reading today. And of course, no, I'm not talking about the pandemic, right? It's this letter, this part of the letter. How do we keep a body of believers connected when separation was not just easier, it was also safer? So Hebrews 10:23, and like I said, for me, that comes in the middle of the paragraph, 23 through 36. Anyone like to start?
I can start.
Thank you.
Let us hold on firmly to the hope we profess, because we can trust God to keep his promise. Let us be concerned for one another, to help one another, to show love and do good. Let us not give up the habit of meeting together as some are doing. Instead, let us encourage one another all the more, since you see that the day of the Lord is coming near. For there is no longer any sacrifice that will take away sins if we purposely go on sinning after the truth has been known to us. Instead, all that is left is to wait in fear for the coming judgment and the fierce fire which will destroy those who oppose God. Anyone who disobeys the law of Moses is put to death without any mercy when judged guilty from the evidence of two or more witnesses. What then of the person who despises the Son of God, who treats as a cheap thing the blood of God's covenant which purified him from sin, who himself the Spirit of grace? Just think how much worse is the punishment he will deserve. For we know who said, I will take revenge, I will repay. And also who said, the The Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Remember how it was with you in the past. In those days after God's light had shone on you, you suffered many things, yet were not defeated by the struggle. You were at times publicly insulted and mistreated, and at other times you were ready to join those who were being treated this way. You shared the sufferings of prisoners, and when all your belongings were seized, you endured your loss gladly, because you knew that you still possessed something much better, which would last forever. Do not lose your courage then, because it brings with it a great reward. You need to be patient in order to do the will of God and receive what he promised.
Thank you. I'm gonna write down that last phrase. It was, do not lose your courage. Comes with every reward. All right. Thank you. Hebrews is verbose with lots of phrases. So we're gonna walk through, like, if I were going to, I try to like clump together like thoughts like into segments. So I would say there's 4 sections or 4 movements to what was just read by Katie. Encouraging words, then words of warning, and then a backward glance, and then a look forward. Okay, that's kind of how the sections flow. So again, this is arbitrary, but if I were to put markers around it or like section it off, I would say verses 23, 24, and 25 are encouraging words. So what is the writer's advice? Should they gather regularly or not?
Yes. Meet. Let us
Yes.
not give up the habit of meeting together.
And why? What's the use or what's the reason one should do that?
Encouraging.
Spur one another toward love and good deeds.
Yes, yours says spur toward love and good deeds. Mine says provoke. I can't remember what yours said, Katie. This is about verse 24, I think.
Be concerned for one another, so much less strong.
Yeah, that be concerned sounds very, very nice and Lutheran sort of.
Continue to encourage
Continue to encourage.
one another.
Is that what happens when people meet together regularly? I mean, let's kind of push against this idea. Would you say, yes, this is the way it happens? Would you say, no, it can you can provoke one another to love and good deeds or encourage or whatever word we spur without meeting together? Do those things have to go together? I'm pushing you. I'm just curious.
It helps.
It helps, Bernice says. I'm in the it helps camp too. So how about you when you read this? What do you think? Does everybody feel this way in your faith community? In your life?
Obviously not. As Christians, but showing up for times like this or worship or any reason.
Right.
This is a heck of a lot better than Zoom for me.
So, people are laughing and agreeing, so I think we all feel that way. Here's what I'm wondering about. If let us not neglect meeting together is a helpful Christian principle, but it's a minority opinion amongst the milieu. Do you think it was a minority opinion when Hebrews was being written? I'm curious, you know what I'm saying? So like, again, as Pastor Nick said, there's a lot of professing Christians, but whether or not they were tending to that meeting together piece. I think we get a sense sometimes of the New Testament, like, and everyone got along, you know, because there's those pieces in Acts where it's like, And I laugh whenever we get to Acts 2, it's like, and it has everything in common, and everybody shared. Everybody shared with each other. It's like, everybody shared joyfully. I mean, maybe I'm cynical, I don't know, but so I'm thinking about that for this too. I'm thinking about, would this have been seen as, I mean, that's good for you guys, but like, whoa, let's not get too crazy here with like the meeting together part. You know what I mean? What do you think?
I think knowing my personality and not liking conflict and not wanting to feel unsafe, you know, I'm not a risk taker. If I felt threatened, if my personality lived at that time, I wouldn't have met together.
When the threat was physical violence, that feels different to you than the threat of the potential of contracting a disease. How many agree with, I mean, I can't not be a female person, so it's very hard for me to imagine. You know, you talked about someone bigger than you, and I'm thinking, oh, my criteria is a lot less than that. Even if they have like a scary voice, I'm gonna keep my mouth shut. Do you know what I mean? Because like our physical experiences are very different, I think, in the world.
We can't see the virus, you know,
Can't
like
see
you can, typically you can assign a shape or a sound or
Yes.
something to that violence, but
Good point. And so the threat is still real, but because it's invisible, perhaps it's easier to discount it or, and I mean, we're hearing that now, you know, this kind of, it will never happen to me, and then it does, sort of an idea. So first century culture is very much based on honor and shame. If you departed from the norms, there would be judgment, there would be disapproval from your community, and of course from your extended family, you know, the clan. Things would be severe and embarrassing for you. Added to that, you know, the Roman government wasn't super keen on the Christians, so that meant persecution and martyrdom were definitely part of the equation for the Hebrews, right? For the audience of the letter to Hebrews. Yeah, go ahead.
Things that framework here is they are expecting Christ to return in the very immediate future.
Absolutely.
And life would look different, I think, for all of us if we really believed that Christ was coming back next week.
Or even in the next 5, if it was in your 5-year plan,
Or, yeah.
right?
I
It's kind of like, you know, 2-3 bananas.
You guys. Yes. And so the words strike differently based on, you know, what we can imagine, and then also the very real context, which is truly inescapable. I would say of all of the New Testament, really, any letter we read, that return idea would have been imminent. We wrestled with a little bit when we walked through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because, you know, there was that question about, well, like, what, okay, well, Jesus didn't return, so like, should we get married? And is it okay to eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? You know, there's all these practical concerns because Jesus hasn't showed up again yet. And this is maybe even a little further on down that road. And so you've got the operational, like, okay, well, Jesus isn't here yet. And the heat is kind of on politically and socially for us, right? So all of those things are at work. But despite all that, the writer is presenting a pretty clear case, right? To hold to this divine covenant with Christ. Even if the former one, sort of the covenant with Moses, was more socially or politically acceptable, and I can't say it was super acceptable, but it was at least more well known. But it's this idea of like ultimate reward, right? That outweighs the temporary suffering, okay, that the believers face. Okay, so this argument actually begins a lot earlier in the book of Hebrews. If you flip to Hebrews 1, there is this kind of, it begins right away. Long ago, God spoke to ancestors in various ways by the prophets, but in these last days, ding, 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 last days, he has spoken to us by a son who he has appointed heir of all things. So, you know, it's this idea of the greater reward or the ultimate inheritance. So then the first few chapters of Hebrews are spent kind of showing the superiority of Christ over the Hebrew prophets. Not that the Hebrew prophets weren't important, but Christ was superior to them. So then by the time we get to where we read today in chapter 10, that case has been made, right? That we can have confidence to enter a sanctuary, I think it says, by the blood of Jesus. That's verse 19. So it's like right before the section that we read. So we start with 23, 24, 25. We got some words of encouragement, right? And they're not pat you on the head words of encouragement, I think is what we're saying. They are like a deep appeal to who we really are and why it's important. So then, starting with verse 26, and I would say probably going all the way to 31, we have words of warning. So the first words are encouraging, the second words are the warning. And I think Kay's, I really sometimes like the good news because it's so, it doesn't worry about trying to match the phrasing. So sometimes I catch the idea, I think, a little bit better. And I think Kay said, all that is left is the fear of judgment is sort of one of the phrases that is in her section here. So these words of warning come up. I think we can infer then that this community was definitely discouraged, right? Contemplating even departure from this new Christian teaching to the old sacrificial system. So why not just return to it? What case is the writer presenting? Why not go back? Fear of judgment?
And once you've known Christ, you can't go back because then you're rejecting Christ, and that's worse yet.
Yeah. And there's even a quote around this judgment or this rejection, and it's a little scary. Do you have a quote? Do you have a footnote about that? I think it's verse 30.
For I will take revenge, I will repay. And then the other one is the Lord will judge his people.
Do you guys remember the movie? I think it was Cape Fear, where Robert De Niro's the bad guy. I know. And the part that made me do that was the part where you saw his tattoo that said vengeance is mine, because I knew it was this passage. I'm like, oh, he's so evil. Right? Because this, I mean, it's so, retribution is such a scary concept. And here it is, just sort of tossed off. So are these words of warning saying you think persecution by the Roman government is bad? I mean, how would this function if you were reading this?
Well, in this verse here, it says, it is a terrifying thing. Which is the Robert Jr.
Yours is terrifying. This is verse 31 that Kay's looking at. What do the rest of you have? Because I don't have the word terrifying.
I have fearful.
Fearful.
I have dreadful.
Dreadful. Ooh, that's a good. And so I wonder, is it like full out warning, like bridge out, do not go any further? Or is it something else? Do you think it is bridge out?
I think so.
Do not pass. Yeah, I think so too. Have a great day, Ms. Boutique.
Yes.
So the yes, day two, just like you never left.
Yeah.
Thank you for all you do. So the focus here is on, I think, willfully persisting in sin, right? This is not like taking an extra cookie, you know, the minor stuff, but it's this intentional rejection, right, of Jesus as the one in whom we have faith, and like rejecting our own ability to keep the law. So chapter 10 circles back. There are warnings also in chapter 6. I think it's verse 4, and it's not the only warning. There's an extended warning in chapter 3. It's like verses 7 through 19, where turning away from the living God and turning away from the community is not good. And so the community is designed to exhort each other, right? So we've talked before, I think, about the Mediterranean worldview of patron and client relationships. Have we talked about that? I think we have. So the patron grants favors to the client. Sometimes that's finances, sometimes that's access, sometimes that's freedom. St. Paul sort of rejects this idea. You know, he did not want to be the like sponsored, like holy man, right? He wanted to earn his own living because he was rejecting that system. But patron and client were very, I mean, that was a very well-established like category of the social structure. So the patron grants the finances or the access or the freedom to the client responds with gratitude and honor. And if the client would ignore that relationship or blow off that relationship, that's where things get very oppositional. And some people, I bring that up because some scholars say that's what's inferred or alluded to here in verses 26 through 31. These words of warning are like the consequences of spurning the Son of God, who's like your patron. Okay, don't be ungrateful, basically, for all you've been given. So that's kind of the section on the warning. If we move on, and I want to march through because it looks like we need 2 timelines. Verses 32 through 34. So 32 for me begins a new paragraph. So 32 through 34 are like the backward glance. Okay. And the reader is encouraged to recall the former days, right? But are they worthy of nostalgia? Were they so great?
I don't know, it sounds like it was all bad.
Yay, let's look back and it doesn't even look like look back with fondness.
Do you think though, it shows them that they did it once, they can do it again?
So the backward glance is not nostalgia, like the feel-good nostalgia. It is what is the point? Why would that motivate you?
You had strength before, you'll have strength now.
Yeah, so it's like, well, I mean, what do you read? What happened in the former days?
Publicly insulted, mistreated, imprisoned, your belongings were seized.
So there was plunder of possessions, there was like general reproach, there was the social suffering, there was rejection from the synagogue likely as well. And what did that cause in the believers in terms of their character? I think verse 34 helps us with that a little bit. What was it? What do you have?
You endured your loss.
You endured your loss.
Gladly.
Cheerfully accepted.
Cheerfully accepted.
And compassion.
Yes, so you're seeing this like, this is causing a deepening of character. So instead of breaking you, it like breaks you open, right? I mean, that's, I think, the idea in verse 34. So faith in Christ did not necessarily end hardship. It may have caused more, but it gave the community something too, right? That's I think, that's the main idea here.
I still wish we would get the audience's view when they're hearing, you know, what.
Yes.
It's like they're being told all this, it's like, really? You know, you'd like to hear,
Exactly.
yeah,
Wouldn't
how it was
you?
accepted.
Wouldn't you? God, it seems relevant to today, doesn't it? So then we look forward, verses 35 and 36. We get the therefore, even though my verse 35 is in the middle of the paragraph, at least mine has the therefore. The idea is what? What are you being called? What is the community being called to?
Be patient, because you will get the promise.
Okay.
You couldn't take the real treasure. You couldn't kick that out. The real treasure's in your heart. It's there.
Intangible, right? You can't take away what you can't touch. And it's like this idea of don't stop now, right? If I hadn't already titled, because I work ahead a little bit, if I hadn't already titled your study today as Perseverance, I probably would have titled it Don't Stop Now, because I think it gives us a better idea of what we're talking about. And perseverance sounds like a very churchy big word. But it's this idea of it can't be taken away. The fulfillment of the promise does seem especially far away, especially in the difficult times, right? But this is connecting hope, waiting, and faith. You said patience, so it's that idea of waiting as central to the Christian life. And I do think we could throw in the concepts of obedience here too. And like spiritual maturity, right? Which is like how one gets to this confidence in what God has promised. And essentially, I think you could make the case that this little section that we read says that endurance or perseverance or whatever we want to call it was the expression of God's will for that time and that place. Because these people's lives were inconvenienced or even more made miserable, right, by the people around them, the Roman Empire, the local opponents. But holding to faith to the very end meant that they, kind of like the heroes that we talked about last week, could expect and experience the promise of salvation, that intangible stuff Paige was talking about in the heart. So I have a question. If you had to lift up endurance or perseverance in your faith community right now, what would you say? What would you appeal to?
So.
Give it to us, President Donna. I'm serious. You think about this a lot. I know you do.
I do. And mine says in verse 36, it says, for you to have need of patience. I've been talking patience for 2 years, be patient with us, we'll get through this together. So it says, if you've done the will, that after you've done the will of God, you might receive the promise. Well, that's what we're hoping for, is that once we get through this, we can try to get back to what we had before or something very similar to it. So to me, that's my message right there.
And you would appeal to like what you're seeing right now amongst like the emotional processes that you see and feel probably internally as well as get from the outside, right? This when will we, what about, right? And the answer is, I don't know when, right? But it won't always be like this, we know that. Thank you. Others?
Times like this, tastes of the promise. Sunday, it's the first time I've been to the break. Yes, absolutely. But, at least Christians, excuse me, in Middle East countries that have given up everything. Just like people did 2,000 years ago. Here in this country, in the name of Jesus Christ, we're so afraid of giving up something because of people at the border, or because of refugees that may come from. We live in such a hothouse here in this country. Be sheltered from any kind of sacrifice, that when we are asked or tested to sacrifice a little bit, I hang on to stuff. It's pretty hard to part with some things. And think that maybe there's questions about like border stuff or refugees. God's way of testing us in this country to say, are you willing to give up? Yield to his work. So.
Be more opportunities than tests. Yeah, well, because.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah, and that's risky. That's risky business.
and that really highlights, I think, another nuance of what you're talking about, which is, I would say our tendency, because we like politics of grievance, I mean, we all do, it feels good. To call mild inconvenience persecution.
Yeah. What kind of spoiled brats are we?
Yeah, right, I mean, I'm raising children, so this is, this concept is very much in my mind about like, what we should and should not get worked up about, and also how the gift of perspective, and it's a cliche, but the back in my day, I mean, for those that have not had much, I mean, right, you start to go, I mean, this wasn't so, I think about how did people do this in the 1920s? I really wish in that little archive cabinet, we had some like big old, I don't know, church fight of record in there, so we could read it and see what their response was, and there's nothing. And it makes me wonder, why is there nothing from the 1920s about what did First Lutheran do? Why is there nothing? There's nothing, I think, because people were afraid to talk about it, and they just wanted to move on, right? Because it wouldn't have been nice. And you want to forget about it. And I think, wow, I wish we could talk about that and what that was really like, because I don't think it was easy. I would like to see, and then there were this many people in worship, and then the next week there were this many people. It made me feel better. So I asked the question, if you had to lift up endurance in your faith community right now, what would you appeal to? What would you appeal to?
Well, I mean, we are enduring in a sense, of the pandemic that is going on much longer than what we anticipated. I think the thing that we can own, I mean, it's kind of even, you can use it as a metaphor for Christianity, because we own the faith in Christ, okay, but you also own in a pandemic, if you have the vaccine, you own the vaccine. So you have, it's kind of like that. But you know that you still have to endure this, and your family has to endure it, and all the children that can't be vaccinated, and all the worry that goes with that. You have to endure that until it's over, which now the predictions are about a year from now.
So the sacrifices are also, how do I say this? The sacrifices are sometimes voluntarily undertaken for the good of the neighbor. Yes?
Yes.
So our endurance, when I talked earlier about being part of our witness, maybe not because we need it, because it doesn't feel super good, but maybe because someone else's life depends on it. Yes. This is deep stuff today. I like it. I think if I were to lift up endurance in our faith community right now, I would say, and Donna knows this because we sat in this very room yesterday and had a meeting. I think I would appeal to two things when I think about endurance right now. One is a spreadsheet that I had to make in my office because it contains 100 new people that I've met this year who are part of our ministry that you have never seen. Okay, that to me is like, okay, God's doing something, even if we can't see it and it doesn't look like it did before, it does not mean that it has not happened. And it wasn't until, because I had this note here and this email here about this family here, and it wasn't until I put it all, and I'm really not a spreadsheet person, so like it takes me a long time to like write this stuff up, but I thought this is the only way I'll keep this all straight. So I know who I've had contact with, and like who's enrolling in Sunday school, and then this one is like, I'm not really sure, but so I need to talk to that one more, that kind of thing. But when I counted it up, because it's just words on a thing, but when I counted up, it's not like, right? So that's interesting. And then the other thing I would say is the field of flags on the highway, which I think is a really tangible piece of endurance for a lot of people in our community. Oh, the flags on the highway. the field of flags right now this week. I would appeal to that as part of my, if I had to lift up endurance, like in our context today, that's something else I would point to, because I think it hints at, you know, the meaning that is ascribed to that for a lot of people. Just this, again, the symbolism of making visible what is invisible. It can be really, really important. So how about you? Any other thoughts or comments? We have a couple minutes.
Just thinking about with the immigration things. The prodigal son was an immigrant. He was welcomed back, but when he was an immigrant, when he left, he was in starvation countries, you know, he did not have a good life while he was gone, but he was welcomed back home again. We need to be welcoming these immigrants and not doing the prodigal son thing. We have plenty of food here. We have plenty of nourishment with our Christian life that we need to start taking in and showing these immigrants that there's positive things here and we aren't all in a bad state.
Except we also have people starving in our own communities, which is really crazy.
That's hard
You know,
to-
it's like, we gotta do a better job.
Right.
But then it kind of reminds me of is faith a noun or is it a verb? And that's when I saw that for both, I thought, oh my gosh, that's a definite verb. It's like, get off your butt.
Right. Right. I think so. I think we're catching the gist of Hebrews really well. This is good.
Thanks for interpreting for us.
Well, like I said, it's a lot of phrases and words, and I have help. You know, I have one of the things that I've lost slightly in the pandemic is my creativity to like have idle time to be like, and what should the Wednesday morning Bible study think about this week? You know, and then play. I have to say, like, I don't like. So I have help with like what we should talk about, and maybe even a little bit how we should talk about it. Of course, we go deeper than that because you guys are like you guys are. You are the advanced placement class of Bible study. So most Bible study materials I read, I'm like, I don't think that's gonna work for me. You know, maybe a little bit deeper. So I did, we often read Eugene Peterson. Would you like to hear his interpretation of Hebrews? Okay. He is such a gift. And Pastor Dick knows there's a autobiography or a biography of his life that just came out. And I appreciate him even more. The reason he wrote the message was because he was a parish pastor, and he could tell his congregation found Bible study to be really boring in the sense that they could not figure out how to take it they could not internalize it into their own life, because even the words were just not close enough to the idiom of the people. So that is how he started for his own Bible studies, rewriting the scripture just for his class. And it became like they kind of came alive, and it became so efficacious that he would share that. And then finally, you know, the publisher that he had was like, maybe you should do more. And he's like, oh, who needs another Bible translation? You know, and he'd already written like a zillion books by then. And, you know, they didn't really sell. So, you know, he's just like, why should I go to all this work? Really? He became like so famous, so quick, it was ridiculous. And he was like at the point in his life where he kind of just wanted to retire and live a quiet life. And it didn't matter, because now everybody's asking to speak and go do, and let's talk about this. And it was sort of like oh, great. But anyway, that's the background of the message. And I love, because he worked very hard on the translation. This section is titled, Don't Throw It All Away. Let's keep a firm grip on the promises that keep us going. He, capital H-E, God, always keeps his word. Let's see how inventive we can be in encouraging love and helping out. Not avoiding worship together as some do, but spurring each other on, especially as we see the big day in capital letters approaching. If we give up and turn our backs on all we've learned, all we've been given, all the truth we now know, we repudiate Christ's sacrifice and are left on our own to face the judgment. And a mighty fierce judgment it will be. If the penalty for breaking the law of Moses is physical death, what do you think will happen if you turn on God's Son, spit on the sacrifice that made you whole, and insult this most gracious Spirit, capital S. This is no light matter. God has warned us that he'll hold us to account and make us pay. He was quite explicit. Vengeance is mine, and I won't overlook a thing. And God will judge his people. Nobody's getting by with anything, believe me. Remember those early days after you first saw the light? Those were the hard times. Kicked around in public, targets of every kind of abuse. Some days it was you, other days your friends. If some friends went to prison, you stuck by them. If some enemies broke in and seized your goods, you let them go with a smile, knowing they couldn't touch your real treasure. Nothing they did bothered you. Nothing set you back. So don't throw it all away now. You were sure of yourselves then. It's still a sure thing, but you need to stick it out, staying with God's plan, so you'll be there for the promised completion. All right, our closing prayer is Psalm, they've done Psalms, and this is Psalm 27. So let's pray. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? All right, next time, I can't believe it'll be the middle of September. It's next week, September 15th. Conquering the World is our study. We're actually going to move to 1 John. We're going to look at part of chapter 4 and part of chapter 5. It's about kind of responding with Christ-like love. You know, if you've noticed, this whole Confident Hope study is sort of like, if it's a gemstone, we're just looking at it from different viewpoints. So if things start to feel similar, there's a reason for that, right? We're kind of looking at a thematic study this time and how faith can and does overcome. So thanks for coming this morning, everybody. You're welcome. Thanks for being with us, Eaton.